what's the biggest achievement that you think has been for the Office of the Information Regulator since you've been appointed?
I mean, imagine 2016, December, you get a letter that you are now the chair of the Information Regulator. All that you have is a piece of legislation in a booklet, no office, nothing, and you have to start it from the beginning. And we did that. At the moment, we now have an office. We have 100 staff members, believe it or not, having started from nowhere. And we have the enforcement committee. I think that's the biggest achievement, that the enforcement committee is now up and running. And people have been saying we are probably a toothless bulldog. The enforcement committee is sitting at the moment considering complaints of POPIA and of POPIA. So for me, that's the biggest achievement, because we can now begin to enforce POPIA effectively.
So if we were to kind of take you back to 2016, before you were appointed, what piece of advice would you give to Advocate Dracula today, to the Advocate Dracula from back then?
You know, when we started, of course, we started by we went to countries that had data protection laws before on a study tour. And we started with the establishment of the administration of the regulator. But looking back, what we should have done was probably to draft guidance notes.
Okay.
We should have used that time to draft guidance notes, as you know, on prior authorization, on applications for exemptions, processing of personal information of children, and trans-border flow of personal information. Because we only started doing that in 2021 when the Act came into effect. And we had to rush through those kind of things. And looking back, we should have studied the Act and looked at how we're going to implement it and put in place implementation mechanisms, and also looked at guidelines for issuing of codes of conduct. I think we should have started there.
Okay. What do you think are the biggest challenges that your office faces currently?
You know, data breaches is a big problem in this country, bigger than people think it is. Security compromises, as we call it. Because just to give you an example, from October last year to now, we have had more than 500 notification of data breaches, because every public body, every private body that has suffered a security compromise or a data breach has to notify us. There is no threshold. Even if only one person was breached, they still have to notify us. And if you look at 500, it's 564 to be precise, which means that in a month, this country suffers about 56 data breaches, major and minor ones.
Wow.
I think we are, you know, one of the highest in the world with data breaches.
Okay. And then maybe kind of looking at your mandate as the Office of the Information Regulator, in that kind of, with that in mind, is your role more kind of enforcement, or is it like education and training? Because obviously if 56 companies are getting breached on that basis, do we need to be doing more? Do you need to be doing more?
It's both. It's an enforcement and it's also education. We are so overwhelmed with requests for education especially from the private sector, that we're even actually talking about a strategy of how are we going to do this, because we cannot, you know, provide education to individual companies. We're thinking that we should combine sectors so that if we're going to be speaking to people, we can say, okay, we're going to speak to the banks through the Banking Association of South Africa, or to mobile operators, and we put them together, or to credit bureaus, you know. And that's the strategy that we're going to adopt for those of you who are thinking of approaching us for stakeholder engagement or for training. It's just becoming impossible, really. The demand is high. POPIA is a complex piece of legislation. The enforcement thereof also is quite complex.
So delving into what you said there about the different sectors, In terms of POPIA compliance, which kind of sectors, which types of organizations keep you awake at night? Who are the most troublesome? I mean, personally, I would put forward the cold calling, telemarketing people, but I don't want to put words into your mouth.
Credit bureaus,
Okay.
they are the first. And then you have the mobile operators, the financial institutions, and direct marketing sector. I mean, you might have seen, I always see an advert on television of one of the direct marketing companies. They say, if you want to buy, here's a number, contact us on this number and send us your ID. It baffles me. What are they doing with people's ID? I mean, an ID is a unique identifier. If you're selling goods and you want people to buy those goods, why are you collecting their ID? And that particular company, we are actually setting our sights on it.
Do you want to reveal the name here and now?
No.
Okay.
It shall remain nameless.
Okay. Okay. So then, as an outsider looking in, I suspect, I mean, James was mentioning earlier, we kind of cover this stuff, but we're not experts in it. I suspect one of the challenges that you face within your own institution, but perhaps within the wider ecosystem that you operate in, within the justice cluster, is going to be skills. What are the levels of skills within those 100 employees at your office to be able to deal with those technicalities, to be able to kind of understand not just the complex legislation, but also the complexities of cyber attacks, all the different kind of breaches, points of entry, all that kind of complexity. Yeah, and how much training is needed to kind of keep those people up to get them up to speed?
At the moment, there's the skill sets that we have in the organization to deal with data breaches. It's still adequate. But time is going to come, obviously, where we're going to need more training or even outsourcing. I mean, if you're dealing with a data breach of the magnitude of TransUnion, we can investigate it, but at the same time, you have to bring forensic investigators in the IT to investigate that kind of breach. But what we are doing now, we are now creating a special unit in the organization, which is called the Security Compromise Unit. We're using that word. People say data breach. We don't use that. That's the GDPR, and we're not GDPR. We are POPIA, so we're using the terminology of security breach for a data breach. So we are creating that unit. We have already, I think, advertised positions. As far as the judges are concerned, you know, judges don't like to be trained by non-judges. So you can't go to the judiciary and say to them, we're going to train you in POPIA. I've had informal discussions with one of the judge presidents of one of the divisions and said to him, hey, this train is moving and is moving fast. I'm hoping that you are prepared for what is coming. The lawyers, yes, some of them I know that they have had some training, but until they go to court and litigate on POPIA, it's all theory. Mm-hmm. I don't think, with the greatest of respect, that in this country we have POPIA experts. In fact, I think the regulator is best placed to call itself, you know, an expert in this field, because we've been dealing with this piece of legislation now for 6 years. Some of us, the 5 members, the commissioners, the 4 and I, at least for the past 6 years, we've been dealing with this piece of legislation. Even the people that we have employed, the ones who came earlier came, I think, in 2020, 2021, and they're still also battling with the interpretation of this piece of legislation. So I think there's a need for upskilling of the judiciary, because very soon there's going to be cases going before the courts. Because I don't think, with the fines of 10 million or even 10 years imprisonment, I don't think any private sector or public sector body for that matter is just going to take out the 10 million and say, oh, regulator, there you are, we are paying you. Obviously, they are going to challenge our decision. You must remember that the decisions of the regulator are binding, so that if you then don't want to abide by that decision, you have to challenge it in court. So I think there is a need for everyone to upskill themselves in this piece of legislation.
Okay. So talking about that kind of the punishment, the court system, and all of those things, I mean, the threat of 10 years in prison, the threat of 10 million rand fines, when do you think we'll start to see that actually reach the courts? When do you think we'll see our first case being successfully kind of prosecuted? And what are the kind of things that would get it to that stage, the kind of severity that would get it to that stage?
I think we're not naive. We're living in a country that is experiencing high levels of crime, serious crime. And the police are not coping with investigation of serious crime. So do you think that if we go to the police and say, Company X has violated POPIA, can you please prosecute? Do you think they're going to do that? Let's be realistic about it. They can't prosecute crime. I'm not saying that it will not happen, but what I'm saying is that we have to be strategic as the regulator in terms of the enforcement of our powers. And if you have, for instance, one responsible party who was negligent in the way that they handled personal information of 4 employees, you just tell them, say, maybe they did not delete the personal information of the employees once the employees left the company. You just tell them that, please delete that personal information and give us proof that you have deleted it. And that's the end of the matter. We will not go to the police for prosecution or of that kind of non-compliance. But the strategy that we have taken, we're going to look at the magnitude, the scale. If we're talking about data breaches, for instance, the magnitude, the seriousness, the impact, and those are the cases that we're going to take forward, also to the police and as far as funds are concerned. So we can't just take any small case, we'll take the serious ones.
And when do you expect we'll see our first case in court?
I mean, I'm not sure. Let me tell you, this is public knowledge. The major, because you must know that apart from the data breaches, we have also complaints about non-compliance with other provisions of POPIA, because POPIA, as you know, is based on the 8 conditions for the lawful processing of personal information. So we have cases like that come. But at the moment, the ones that we are looking at are breaches. We are doing a number of them. The big ones is TransUnion, as you know. There is Experian, that is still, not complete. We have the Department of Justice, which we are doing. We have DISCAM, we have UNISA. So those are the big ones that we are dealing with at this point in time. That some of them will be ready soon to go to the enforcement committee, because what we do, we have to investigate first, compile a report, an investigation report, and that's the report that goes to the enforcement committee, which is a committee of outsiders. And that committee then makes a finding and a recommendation on the action that has to be taken. The finding and the recommendation come to us as the 5 members. We either accept the recommendation or we reject it. So it's quite a long process.
You mentioned there the Department of Justice.
Yeah.
As I understand, that's where your organization sits.
Exactly.
Does that not make this a little bit of a difficult conversation to have?
No.
Okay.
It doesn't, because we separate the roles. Because we are not, and maybe I need to clarify this, the regulator is not an entity of the Department of Justice. It is an independent institution. The Department of Justice is assisting us, or is still assisting us with the establishment of the regulator. We are using some of their processes and systems and policies until such time we have adopted ours.
Sure.
And at the time when they were breached, we're still using the emails of the Department of Justice, and for a period of time we couldn't function. But insofar as investigating the data breach, the ransomware, we have to separate the roles, because what we are doing, we are looking at the adequacy and the efficacy of the security measures that they had put in place. So there's a Chinese wall, if I can put it that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then quickly, have you got your own email set up now, away from their infrastructure?
We are still there.
Okay.
Some of it, yeah, but not all.
And
But
then-
we are separate from the IT. We have our own systems completely.
And then in terms of public sector, I think it was last year's matric results. There was
Yeah.
a kind of story about the confusion that they couldn't be published because they didn't want to put people's details out there. How are you finding the public sector as an entity or a kind of broad ecosystem in terms of their acknowledgement of what POPIA is and how it kind of relates to them?
Slow.
Okay.
I think the private sector is, the compliance in the private sector is quite high. Maybe it's because the private sector knows that non-compliance will hit their bottom line. So with the public sector, I mean, it's all our monies, isn't it? If there's a fine, who pays the fine is us, isn't it? That's the truth. It's us who pays, the taxpayers. So compliance in the public sector is not as good. But the Department of Education, what we then did, we then went and did an assessment of their privacy policies, and we then also informed them quite early that you can't publish those matric results until you get each parent to consent.
Okay.
To consent, and we had to, work with them on the consent form, which they had to send to the parents to sign, to give consent for the results to be published.
Okay. So looking ahead, going back to Graham's points earlier, it's good to always look to the future. We'll look at our ID numbers today, we'll be looking at keeping our banking details, our email addresses, all that kind of stuff safe. But as we kind of evolve with technology, there's more kind of personal information. I'm talking about our DNA, I'm talking about our biometrics, that's all kind of getting stored in places. So what's the Office of the Information Regulator's kind of outlook? What's your work? What's your kind of opinions about where we're going with that, storing that hyper kind of sensitive personal information? We've got the Department of Affairs ABIS database coming up. I mean, that's going to be potentially a gold mine for hackers to kind of get that personal information.
I mean, it's not up to us. It's up to the department to ensure that with that system that they are putting in place, they have to ensure that they have adequate security measures to protect that personal information.
Sure.
But what we're talking about is actually even not as scary as what is happening in the world of technology. If you look at Chat GPT at the moment, what are the privacy implications of Chat GPT? And it's something that I think as regulators throughout the world, we have to begin to look at that artificial intelligence. My son-in-law yesterday, as we were talking about these things, who's in advertising, was actually saying to me, what about technology singularity? What's going to happen in the future where our lives will be less important than those of machines? And all those technological advancements, what are the implications thereof on data protection, on personal protection of personal information? Are the data protection authorities going to play catch up? We're already playing catch up, but is data protection going to be seriously, will we be able to regulate it in the future when we look at what is coming up in the horizon? I'm scared. Fortunately, I won't be there when when now machines will then be more important than us humans. I will not be there.
It's getting there. I don't know whether you saw that recently. We're now being asked by ChatGPT if we're, as humans, if we're robots.
Yeah,
So
I know. I saw one day we asked the president whether they can predict the cabinet that is going to be that the president is going to appoint when he reshuffles, and ChatGPT says, no, I can't answer that question. But I'm sure in the future it will be able to answer that question, because they will have all our personal information and they can do all the whatever it does and say, here are the names of the new cabinet.
So then you were kind of touching on like our data going out to, I guess, international kind of vendors and those kind of things. How much are you working with other international regulators? And if there was, and I'm not saying it happened, but if there was a Facebook breach, like how much interaction would you have with those kind of international service providers?
No, we do. We belong to the Global Privacy Assembly. We are members of that. and we share experiences, and so we do share. And talking about WhatsApp, by the way, we're still doing an assessment on WhatsApp on that privacy policy that they introduced in May 2021, and just looking at its compliance with the protection of personal information. I know that our sister organizations in Europe looked at that compliance, but I mean, we are not GDPR, we are POPIA, so we have to ensure that when they are in South Africa, for the South African users, they have to comply with our law.
Okay. And then in terms of kind of collaboration, and I'm going to show my ignorance here, but I think there's a system called MITRE ATT&CK, which basically kind of collates all the different types of attacks that have been experienced. Is that something that the information regulator could look to replicate with our own kind of South African, the kinds of threats that we're seeing here?
You know, we haven't gotten to that, but I think our sister organization in the UK, many years ago, they had, and I think it was with, if I'm not mistaken, I'm speaking under correction, with direct marketing, they had what they called the Robinson list, which they abandoned, because now if you put that information in a database, unless you secure that information, that database can also be breached.
Sure.
So you have to be careful on how we haven't gotten to that, but the Robinson list experience says to us you have to be careful, because that list was even hacked. So we haven't even looked at that, whether we can put in a database and categorize the types of data breaches that have occurred. Maybe we'll do that, as long as we do it in a way that will not compromise, the information won't be compromised.
Sure, okay. When you go to visit a friend, or you go to an office block,
Yeah.
and you get to the security desk and they expect you to fill in your ID number, they want to see your driving license, they want to scan your car disc. Do you ever pull that, do you know who I am? And like,
no,
okay.
I don't.
But like, what do you think we're doing
I
with that?
refuse to give them that information.
Do you?
I do. I say to them, why do you want that information? They say it's for security. I say the only information that you need is my registration and the color of my car. That's it. You'll be, and to see whether I'm male or female, or what am I dressed in. What are you doing with all this information? I mean, they scan, you know, the disk. Once they scan that, it has all your personal information, even your address, everything. That is why there are so many data breaches in this country, because our personal information is all over the place. And we don't know what eventually happens. But I refuse.
Okay.
And then they say, you can't enter. I say, call the manager then. And then when the manager comes, I explain politely who I am. But there's no point in saying that to security people. They won't know what you are talking about.
Sure. Okay.
But I also did that I went to the graveyard at Four Ways, and they had a calendar, you know, and they had people's birth dates. So I asked nicely, I said, why did you ask these people whether you can put their birth dates on your calendar? They say, no, but it's a nice thing because so that we remember that. I said, no, but you can't. So the manager came when he had this conversation and said, you must be from POPIA. I said, yes. I said, next time, please ask these people to give you permission, consent to put their birthdays on your calendar. Because it's displayed there, it's written names, so-and-so, Pansy Tlakula, 12th June, you know, it's like that. So that we have to change those kinds of practices.
Advocate Dracula, that's been great. Thank you for your time this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, if you can please give her an astounding round of applause.
Thank you.